Chair now recognizes a gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week marked the death of the tyrant in Cuba, Fidel Castro. This is a man whose regime was marked by the suppression of God-given rights, the right to religion, to speech, to assemble. The people who disagreed with the regime in Castro's Cuba were jailed or tortured. People who had spent their lives building businesses, restaurants, hotels, had their property confiscated after the Cuban Revolution, and people were executed by the thousands who ran afoul of the regime. Now pre-Castro Cuba, economic opportunity, prosperity, but you did have a yearning for democratic reforms. It was effectively an authoritarian system, and Castro capitalized on this by pointing out that we needed to have free elections. And so there were people that supported Castro initially because they thought he was going to usher in democratic reforms. He duped to people. Once he had the opportunity to seize power, he sided with the Soviet Union and imposed the Stalinist tyranny on the small island nation. And I think it's interesting when people look back to see how poorly Cuba has done under his rule. Compare that with a lot of the Cuban exiles who left Castro's tyranny. These are people who, many of them came to Florida. A lot of them didn't speak the language. You're in a new country. Didn't necessarily have a whole lot of advantages, and yet Cuban Americans in our country have excelled at all levels in business and in government and athletics, entertainment, you name it. Meanwhile, you look at the people over the last decades in Cuba, and unless you're attached to the ruling class, the regime, the intelligence services, the military, you basically have no shot to do anything to advance your life and to make the most of your God-given ability. And the Cuban exiles who came to Florida, a lot of them were responsible for really putting Miami on the map. So I think that shows when you have folks fleeing a tyranny, coming to freedom, they can succeed beyond people's wildest dreams, but the people who are suffering under the tyranny, they just had nowhere to go. It's funny because you look at some of the media reports, Castro is lauded by some as a, quote, egalitarian, that this was a big deal, that he was an egalitarian. And part of that, look, I have to admit, part of that is true. I mean, he was an egalitarian in the sense that he inflicted the equal suffering, equal misery of cross-sections of the Cuban people. So that much is true, but it's obviously false in the sense of his thing wasn't egalitarian, it was to amass power for himself. He died a billionaire. So this is the avant-garde of the working class, supposedly, and he's a billionaire while many Cubans struggle to even eat, and certainly they cannot prosper. We also shouldn't forget, this is a very reckless leader. He brought the world to the brink of a nuclear confrontation in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and once the Soviet Union expired and we had access to these files, Castro was urging Khrushchev to nuke the United States. So you had Khrushchev, this crusty communist Soviet leader, having to be the voice of reason and telling Castro, no, we're not going to do that. We'll end up in a thermonuclear war. But if it was up to Fidel Castro, those nuclear bombs would have been launched. So this is not a complicated legacy. This is not the George Washington of Cuba, as some have said. Washington, he refused power, won a war, refused power, and could have aggrandized power for himself. He did the exact opposite. Castro wrecked Cuba, turned it into an island prison in order to amass power and wealth for himself. And that is his legacy, and the most damning evidence of his failure, his tyranny, and his evil nature are the tens of thousands of people that perish fleeing Cuba, going through the Florida Straits. Those watery graves really stand as a monument to Castro's barbarity, because these are people who know that very likely they're not going to be able to make it. These are shark-infested waters, and yet even the small chance of escaping freedom, and Castro's tyranny was so oppressive that they're willing to do that knowing that they're most likely to meet their own demise. And so as we look forward, let's be honest about the nature of this regime. Let's commit to having actually put pressure on the regime and will help those people who are still in Cuba, who are trying to fight the good fight for freedom, for free elections, and for democratic reforms. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.